Hello and good morning. This is Sudin Anubis, and I'm back with another 9th Age battle report. This is Empire of Sunsol versus Dread Elves, and this is a whopper 6,000 point battle. And so this is game 5 for our Bloodstone of Levana campaign. This is the climatic end to the series, so if you've not seen the other 4 episodes, I'd recommend going to watch those first. There they are, sister, Desra hissed. They have come, just as you knew they would, Alara replied. Send forth all troops. Do not stop until you have Whitestone's heart in your grasp. So here is the battlefield. It is a frontline clash with no secondary objective except for to kill your opponent. So every 1,000 points that you score above your opponent, you gain one of the 3 secondary victory point scenarios. If you look at the battlefield, we have 2 forests, one in the top left, one in the bottom right. We have 2 fields, one in the top right, one in the bottom left. We have an impassable in the top middle, a building in the bottom middle, ruins in the kind of middle left, and water in the middle right. So as this is part of the campaign, we have some of our unique characters, because this is the final for the campaign, all characters are now mortal, which means if they die, they are dead, and if we do another campaign, they will not be returning. So for the Empire of Sunsol, I have 2 unique characters. I have my general, Duke Peter Whitestone himself. He is a knight commander on a war elephant. He is the Sword of Retribution, which gives him +1 armor, +1 AP, flaming attacks, and multiple wounds D3. He is the Armor of Virtue, which gives him 5 up Aegis and allows him to do a 3d6 discipline test. And then he has Tactical Supremacy, which basically makes him a marshal for orders, so he can give a single order to a unit of parent, support, or knight units. And he's a first knight. And then I also have Master Edward Talbot. He is a Wizard of Alchemy. He is the Book of Disdain, which allows him to know all alchemy spells, but he cannot take the heredity spell. He has the Crystal Gazer, which once per turn the bearer may reroll all power or dispel dice, but must take the second result. And the Apron of Tincture, which allows him to get a 4-up Aegis and 4-up armor set. So being a Master of Alchemy, he has all 6 alchemy spells, as you can see here. And then my opponent also has 2 unique characters. The first is Alara, who you've probably seen in previous battle reports. She is a Beastmaster on a Mana Core. She has the Alara's Warcry, which gives her devastating charge, distracting, and hatred. The Spear of Agony, which at the beginning of Initiative Step 10, she makes an attack. If she hits, then her opponents suffer a -1 to hit her. And the Tiara of Rage, which is +1 armor and battle focus. And then her sister, Desra, who has not been seen before, she is a Dread Princess on a dragon. She has the Nightshade Blades, which are paired weapons. They have poison, and they poison on a 4-up instead of a 6. And if my opponent rolls a 6, then they become AP 10. And she also has the Crown of the Serpents, which gives her a 4-up Aegis saves, and all friendly units within 6 inches a 5-up Aegis save. So on my opponent's right flank, there is Nessie, which is a Hydra. Next to that is a group of Fanatical Revelers of the Hunt, which are the old Dancers of Yema. With them is Frigga, the Forge Master, who is of Alchemy, who is a Temple Militant of Alchemy. Behind them is a block of Silver Spears, which are just Spearmen. To the kind of right of those are the Swift Death, which is a block of 20 crossbows. Behind them is Alara on her Manticore. In the center of the battlefield, we have an effigy of Dread, kind of there in the back. In front of that is Amethyst in the water. Since it's a Kraken, it does not care about water. To the right of that is the Disciples of the Scarlet Serpent. And then on my opponent's left flank, there's Desra's Judgment, which is a group of 20 Judicators with the full command and Eye of the Gorgon banner. Behind them is Desra herself on her dragon. Next to that is Morgana the Candle Witch. So she is on a Pegasus, and she's being played with that beautiful snake model. To the right of that is the Knight's Terror, a block of knights. And then to the right of that are the Scarlet Blades, which are 15 Corsairs. So if we look at Peter Whitestone's army, he has the Express Riders, which are 10 riders with the repeating rifles. To the left of that, I have the 1st Legion Cohort, which is just a block of 40 Spearmen. To the left of that, I have the Steadfast 8th, which is a block of 27 Imperial Guard with full command and the Rending Banner and shields. And behind them, I have Bishop Wilhelm Reinhold, who is on a War Altar. And then in the center of the battlefield, I have the third Dragoon, which is 10 knights, full command. To the left of them, I have the Black Knaves, which is another group of 10 knights. And behind them, I have the War Guard, which are 3 War Elephants with full command, and Peter is with them. And then on my left flank, I have the first Lancers, which is another group of 10 knights, and with them is a Prelate. To the left of that, I have Ironside, which is my steam tank. To the left of that, I have the Victorious Fifth, which is a block of 23 Imperial Guard with full command and great weapons, and with them is Edward. To the left of them, I have 10 crossbows, or the green caps, and on the far left, I have the Fast Riders, which are 5 riders with brace pistols. So my opponent dropped first, and so turn 1, Dread Elves. So my opponent moved up fairly aggressively. You can see the Hydra moved up, the Dancers moved up, the crossbows moved up. The spears moved up, but they kind of were held in reserve. My opponent moved Ilara to kind of come close to the Hydra. The Kraken moved forward, the Medusae moved forward, and then over here on the right flank, my opponent kind of swung around with the Dread Knights and moved up the Corsairs and the Judicators. In Magic phase, my opponent managed to get Glory Gold off on the Dancers, and then in shooting, managed to pick off a single Knight from the first Lancers. And that was my opponent's turn, so that brings us to turn 1 for the Empire of Sunstall. So since my opponent moved up fairly aggressively, I went ahead and declared a number of charges with my Knights. So I declared a charge with my first Lancers into my opponent's Kraken, and declared a charge from the Dragoons into my opponent's Medusae. And the Dragoons made it, and the Lancers did not, however. And over here on the right flank, I just kind of swiveled around, keeping my infantry kind of in the front arc of all my opponent. And then over here on the left-hand side, I moved up a little bit more aggressive, I guess. My riders shot forward and got out of line of sight of the Kraken. Oh, sorry, that's the Medusae. No, that's the Hydra, excuse me. And then I moved up my steam tank, Imperial Guard, and my felled unit of knights. My Black Knaves stayed where they were. They didn't really move up. I'm kind of holding them back in reserve for now. You can see that my opponent's Swift Death, or the crossbows, are fleeing in this picture. So I originally declared a charge with my Lancers into the crossbows. They fled, and then I redirected into the Kraken. In shooting phase, my Express Riders managed to kill 4 of my opponent's Dread Knights. And then in combat, it didn't go so well. My opponent managed to kill 5 of my Knights. I think 3 of those were just from turning into stone statues, and then killed 2 in combat. I only managed to put 1 wound on my opponent. I kind of flubbed the attacks. However, I think I actually did hold. I think I rolled like Snake Eyes for my leadership test, and so I stayed in combat. So there is a picture of what the first turn looks like. So that brings us to turn 2, Dread Elves. So my opponent declared a charge with the Dread Knights into my Knights, or into my Imperial Guard with shields. I held. My opponent declared a charge with the Kraken into the side of my Knights. And my opponent declared a charge with the Dancers into my steam tank, I believe. No, it might have been my Knights. I think it was my Knights. And then my opponent also declared a charge with the Hydra into the green caps, which failed their terror test and ran away. And then I think my opponent either failed their redirect or chose not to redirect. I'm not sure which one. So here you can see my green caps are just barely still on the board. You can see that the Dancers, or the Temple Militants, made it. The Kraken made it, and the Knights made it in the bottom right. And you can see that my opponent moved up their Judicators and their General and Wizard kind of moving up forward. And then in close combat, my opponent easily wiped out my remaining Knights. I don't think I even had a chance to swing. I think they just wiped them out. In close combat down here, my opponent managed to kill 5 of my Knights. I did a few wounds back, but not enough to really matter. I think I broke from combat and fled, if I remember correctly. But I might have stood. We'll find out. In close combat over here with the knights, my opponent came in and killed, looks like 9 of my Imperial Guard with shields. However, I did manage to wipe out all of my opponent's knights, and so I went ahead and just kind of reformed so that I was facing into kind of block formation. So that brings us to Empire of Sunsol turn 2. So over here on the left, I charged my Black Knaves into my opponent's Kraken. You can see that my other knights did hold, it looked like. So I was rolling pretty well in my leadership tests. And then I also declared a charge with both my Imperial Guard and my spears into the Judicators. The Imperial Guard in the front and the spears in the flank. I also declared a charge with my Imperial Guard with great weapons into my opponent's Hydra. And so they made it in. My knights made it into the Kraken, losing 1 over the runes. And both of my block infantry made it into my opponent's Judicators. I was unable to rally my green caps, so they fled off the board. And then my steam tank also random moved into the flank of my opponent's dancers, or temple militants. So here's kind of what it looks like on the left side of the board. You can see I moved up my rider so that they are out of my opponent's spearmen, and just kind of took some pot shots there. You can see my opponent also did rally their crossbows last turn. You will, however, also notice that my opponent's mana core is missing. So I forgot to mention on my first turn, I managed to get Quicksilver Lash off and put 2 wounds on Alara. And then my steam tank cannon managed to hit and put the final 2 wounds on Alara. So turn 1, one of my opponent's unique characters was taken out of the battlefield. And because this was the final campaign, that means that she is dead for good, hopefully. My opponent was a little annoyed, I can understand, but at least it was the character that had previously been in every other battle. So, at least she did get to fight in previous battles. Over here on the right flank, you can see that I moved up my War Altar to give hatred to both of my 2 units. And then in Magic Phase, I also managed to get off Valoon's Blessing, so they will also have reroll to wound. So over here on the left flank, I managed to get Word of Iron off on my Imperial Guard. I made my opponent's Kraken or Hydra flammable. Unfortunately, my opponent did manage to dispel Glory for Gold, so I did not get that off, so I wasn't flaming. But I managed to cause 2 wounds that you can see floating there in the back of the Kraken. I managed to, with just my charge, ranks, banner, and wounds, managed to break my opponent's Hydra. It broke from combat, and I chased it down. And so I caught it and kind of reformed, as you can see here. Also in Magic Phase, I managed to get Corruption of Tin off on my opponent's general, so its armor save is reduced by 1 now. Yeah, I also got Word of Iron off, which you already saw, and Valoon's Blessing, which I managed to get off on in a bubble here with my Prelate. In close combat with the Steam Tank and the Knights, my opponent wiped out the rest of my Knights. My Steam Tank came in and managed to do 6 wounds with its Grinds attacks. My opponent held because they had all that combat res from breaking my Knights, and they just turned to face my Steam Tank. In combat with the Kraken, my opponent only managed to kill 1 Knight, and I managed to put 2 wounds on the Kraken. I won combat, my opponent held. In close combat here with the Judicators, they did quite a few number of wounds. I think they killed off 6 Spearmen and maybe another 6 Imperial Guard. However, with Hatred and Reroll to Wound, I killed 18 of my opponent's Judicators, so there's just 2 there. They broke. I pursued with my Spearmen to the left, which managed to overrun into the Wizard on Pegasus. So that brings us to turn 3. So turn 3, my opponent charged their general into my Knights, which are fighting the Kraken. They charged the Medusae into the front of the Spearmen. And then over on my opponent's right flank, they decided not to charge with the Spearmen. They decided to just kind of back up. They wanted to just shoot me some more before we got into combat. And then the Corsairs just kind of moved up closer. I think they were trying to kind of get close enough so they could charge my War Altar, but they kind of just been sitting out here for the moment. In Magic phase, once more, my opponent managed to get Glory for Gold off on the Dancers, and I think made my Steam Tank flammable again. In shooting phase, my opponent didn't do too many wounds. I think they shot at my Imperial Guard and managed to pick off 1 or 2, but overall not very successful. It helps that I have like a 3-up armor save right now, although I do get a -1 AP because my opponent is close enough now, but not too many wounds. In combat over here, I managed to put 1 wound on the Wizard and 1 wound on the Medusae. I lost like 10 Spearmen, but luckily I was steadfast and held. In combat with the Steam Tank, I only did 1 wound this turn. I think I rolled like 3 grinds. And my opponent managed to put, I think, 2 wounds on my Steam Tank. And then in combat here, yeah, my opponent unleashed its breath weapon and just smashed through my knights. I had 2 knights remaining. I managed to... I don't think I did anything. I don't think I did any wounds. I think I just broke and fled. My opponent pursued with both, and the the Kraken overran into my elephants. The general kind of overran and ended up where you can see here. So this is what it looks like at the end of my opponent's turn 3. So in my charge phase, I charged my Imperial Guard into my opponent's crossbows. They decided to stand and shoot, and oh boy, the shooting last turn didn't do anything. It killed 1 or 2, but the stand and shooting managed to kill like 7 of my Imperial Guard. Luckily, I passed my panic test, but ouch, that hurt. And then my rider just kind of moved up to block the spears so they couldn't charge my flank right away. I also charged my other Imperial Guard, the shields, into my opponent's Medusae, and then moved up the altar so that it was within 6 inches of both again. And this is what it looks like after combat. So you can see that my opponent again killed another 10 or so spearmen, a few of my Imperial Guard. I managed to put a 2nd wound on the Wizard and managed to kill 1 of the Medusae. I lost combat. Luckily, the spearman was still steadfast, and I think I just rolled really low for my Imperial Guard, so both held, luckily. In close combat over here, I killed 2 of my opponent's crossbows. My opponent killed 1 of my Imperial Guard. I think my opponent won combat, but I managed to hold. In close combat with the Steam Tank, so this turn I managed to get... so you can see I got Corruption of Tin off on my opponent's general again. So now it was 2 armor missing. And because of that, I managed to make the Dancers flammable. And so I used my breath weapon this turn on the Steam Tank and managed to kill, I think, 9 of my opponent's Dancers. And so I broke them from combat, but unfortunately, Steam Tank, so couldn't pursue. In combat with the Kraken, my opponent put 2 wounds on 1 of my elephants, I believe, and I managed to put a 3rd wound on the Kraken. It didn't help that Peter flubbed this round and couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. And so it kind of just ended up looking like that, where there wasn't a whole lot of damage either way. So this is the end of picture for turn 3. So you can see that we're starting to run out of units. So that brings us to turn 4, Dread Elves. So my opponent charged their general into my War Elephants. Expected that. Charged the spears into my riders. Expected that, and they'll just get butchered. In Magic phase, my opponent managed to get Curse of the Phantom Queen. Sorry for the blurry picture. On her Wizard. In combat, my opponent easily wiped out my riders. In combat with the crossbows and the Imperial Guard, I killed a couple. I don't think my opponent did any wounds to me, but they held. My opponent managed to rally the fleeing Dancers, which you can see here. And then in combat with the spears, I finally managed to kill my opponent's Wizard, so at least it's out of the battlefield. However, you can see I only had 2 spears left, and they actually end up being killed by the Curse of the Phantom Queen. And then I have just a handful of Imperial Guard left. I managed to put 1 wound on the Medusae, which you can see here, and you can see that my spearman has now been wiped out by the Curse of the Phantom Queen. I lost combat and I fled. My opponent decided to overrun and overran into the flank of my, well, not overrun, but decided to pursue and overran into my war altar. In combat with the generals, the Kraken died this round, and my opponent managed to get into a challenge with my champion, and managed to put 3 wounds on my champion and kill it. I don't remember who won combat, but either way, we stuck around. This is combat on my turn. My prelate managed to kill one of the Medusae. The Medusae put 1 wound on the war altar. Here's kind of an overall battlefield view of turn 4. So you can see that I charged my steam tank into the flank of my opponent's crossbows. My opponent was very surprised with this. I think they expected me to go into the side of the dragon, but honestly, I kind of needed to save my Imperial Guard, so I decided to throw my steam tank into the crossbows to help win that combat. You can see that the riflemen on the horses, they wiped out the Corsairs last turn, and so this turn they kind of just moved closer and took some shots at my opponent's dancers, but unfortunately they were unable to really do anything. I rolled really well with my grinds this turn. I think I rolled like 8 grinds, and I think like 7 of them hit. So between my grinding and my Imperial Guard, I managed to grind out my opponent and break them. I had them run away from my Imperial Guard, and I pursued with my Imperial Guard, so that way they would get out of the line of sight of my opponent's spearmen. So this is what it looks like before combat. So you can see that my opponent has 1 wound on the general so far. And this is what it looks like after combat. So I managed to put 1 more wound on my opponent, and my opponent managed to do 5 wounds, I think. Or no, sorry, I managed to do 3 wounds, because I had 2 wounds already on my elephants from the Kraken. My opponent killed off 1 elephant and put 2 more wounds on my other elephant. My opponent wasn't going after my general yet, so my general had 1 wound from a previous Touch of the Reaper spell. You can also see that the Corruption of Tin has now been up to 3, so I managed to get Corruption of Tin off on my last turn. So I've now effectively removed all my opponent's armor. So they just have their 4-up Aegis now. Plus, resistance 6 for Dragon, but no armor is nice. I managed to hold. It helps that I'm rolling 46, because Peter is a 3d6 base, and because he can give orders, the only order I'm giving currently is to my elephants to give them steady men. So I have 4 dice to roll and not run away, so that's helpful. So this is kind of what it looks like at the end of my turn 4. So you can see that my Imperial Guard with the great weapons have overran and are now out of line of sight of my opponent's spearmen. The generals are still locked in combat, and the Medusae is still banging away at my war altar, and my opponent's dancers are kind of moving up. So turn 5, my opponent actually decided to kind of flip around and move the dancers the other direction towards my Imperial Guard. And then in combat, my opponent unfortunately managed to wipe out Peter and the other elephant. So Peter is now dead, since this is the final campaign. He did manage to put 2 wounds on my opponent's general, or 3 wounds onto my opponent's general, so she's now up to a single wound remaining. So she's barely hanging on, but unfortunately my opponent did manage to kill Peter. So this is kind of what it looks like at the end of the turn. You can see that I think my opponent charged the steam tank with the spears. The Medusae is still just pounding away at my war altar. I've managed to put 2 wounds on the remaining Medusae, so it's slowly dying, but it's also done a couple wounds. So in my turn, honestly, all I really did is shuffled my gunmen closer, or maybe I didn't even move them closer, so that I could just take some shots at my opponent's general. All I needed to get it was 1 wound through, and I did manage to get that last wound in. So I managed to kill my opponent's general there. My opponent managed to put a couple more wounds on my steam tank, so I think I have 1 wound left on my steam tank. So it's barely hanging on. So my opponent moved the dancers around and cast Quicksilver Lash and managed to kill some of my Imperial Guard. So they are now below a quarter, so my opponent will get victory points for half of them. And my opponent managed to also wipe out my steam tank on the last turn. So that was unfortunate. I was kind of actually hoping that it would just kind of hold them up. But my opponent having spears and also having the Rending Banner, which they popped, having AP2 was just enough to get me to roll enough 1s and 2s to break it. So on my turn, I basically marched my Imperial Guard as far away as I could with my wizard to not die. And so this is kind of what the battlefield looks like. And this picture basically sums up what is left. My opponent does have the Effigy of Dread just above the water here. But overall, it was a bloodbath, which is what we wanted. So that's good. Edward bowed his head in prayer. Goodbye, my friend. I hope you find more peace in the afterlife. Looking up from the Duke Whitestone's body, Edward took in the carnage of the battlefield. The great beasts the foul serpents had brought with them lay dead across the battlefield. Looking down at the blood-red stone in his hand, Edward sighed. Perhaps it would have been best if they had never found it at all. So it ended up being a super close game with only 101 points separating the two sides. So if we look at the breakdown, my opponent managed to kill 4,985 points from me, and I managed to kill 4,884 points from my opponent. So it ended up being a very close game. However, I did manage to get both Alara Clavemore on my side, or wiped out, and my opponent did manage to kill Duke Peter Whitestone, and I managed to kill Desra Clavemore. So I managed to kill both of my opponent's unique characters. My opponent did kill Whitestone, which was one of my unique characters, but Edward, my alchemy wizard, did survive, so he will very likely show up in a future campaign down the road. If we look at points, it ended up being just a 10-10, because there was only a separation of 101 points. The secondary objective didn't come into function because that was so close to the battle, and so it ended up being a draw for the final battle, which ended up being a pretty good game. I really enjoyed it. I think my opponent really enjoyed it, minus losing Alara at the very beginning of the game. It was super bloody. It was actually really funny. We figured the game would take, 4 or 5 hours because it was kind of larger, but because we had a fairly close combat oriented list, by turn 3, most of our troops were dead. So it was really actually a regular 3.5, 4-hour game, but we both really enjoyed it. As I said, this is the final for the Bloodstone of Levana. However, I still have the Bloodstone, so maybe in the future we might do a future campaign. If you guys have any likes or comments, please put those in the comment section below. If you have any suggestions for potentially future campaigns, put those in the section below as well. And as always, game on!